July 1st, 2002. Two planes, one a cargo flight, the other full of children from a Russian youth choir, cross paths above Lake Constance. 71 lives erased in seconds. But the real question behind how did this happen? The Überlingen mid-air collision catastrophe isn't just about a tragic mistake. It's about a hidden gap between man and machine that doomed everyone on board. Why did the systems built to prevent disaster fail so completely? Night had already settled over southern Germany when two aircraft crossed invisible lines above Lake Constance. Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, a Tupolev Tu-154 carried 69 people. Most were children and teenagers from a Russian youth choir, their parents and teachers, bound for a long-awaited cultural trip to Spain. The youngest passengers had spent months preparing for this journey, their excitement captured in photos and home videos shared with family back in Bashkirtan. On board, laughter and songs mixed with the quiet anticipation of adventure. For many, this trip was a reward for academic and artistic achievement, a rare chance to see the world beyond their home city of Ufa. High above them, DHL Flight 611, a Boeing 757 cargo plane, was crewed by two experienced pilots. Their route from Bergamo in Italy to Brussels was routine, the cockpit quiet except for the hum of instruments and the occasional radio call. Neither crew nor passengers could have imagined the danger approaching in the darkness. At 23:35, the two aircraft collided at nearly 35,000 feet. The force of the impact tore both planes apart, scattering wreckage over the fields and forests near Überlingen. Every single person on board, 69 from the Tupolev, 2 from the Boeing, lost their lives in an instant. The scale of the loss stunned both Russia and Germany. Entire families were wiped out. Classmates and teachers vanished without warning. Grief swept through Bashkirtan, where memorials for the children and their loved ones became a focal point for a community searching for answers. The disaster left 71 families shattered, their futures rewritten by a tragedy that should have been impossible. Automated collision avoidance entered commercial aviation with the introduction of TCAS, short for Traffic Collision Avoidance System. By 2002, TCAS-2 was standard on large passenger and cargo aircraft across Europe, Russia, and North America. Its job was clear: detect closing traffic and issue direct, audible commands to pilots, independent of ground control. TCAS worked by interrogating nearby aircraft transponders, calculating closing speeds and altitudes, then issuing advisories in 2 stages. A traffic advisory, or TA, warned crews of possible conflict. Traffic, traffic. If the threat grew, a resolution advisory, or RA, followed, an urgent command to climb or descend immediately. For every potential collision, TCAS issued complementary maneuvers. One aircraft would receive climb, the other descend. The logic was designed so that if both crews followed their TCAS RAs, a collision would be averted. No negotiation, no waiting for controller instructions. But TCAS operated in a regulatory gray zone. In 2002, no universal rule required pilots to obey TCAS over air traffic control. Manuals varied by airline and country. Some trained crews to treat TCAS as an advisory, not an order. Others left the decision up to the captain's judgment. International standards, including ICAO's Annex 10, outlined TCAS use, but stopped short of defining absolute command priority in a conflict. This ambiguity set the stage for confusion in high-stakes moments. When TCAS and ATC gave opposite instructions, flight crews faced a split-second choice: trust the automation or follow the human voice on the radio. In the skies over southern Germany, that gap in clarity would prove fatal. At 23:34 and 42 seconds, a warning cut through the calm in both cockpits. The TCAS system on each aircraft triggered a traffic advisory. Traffic, traffic. For the crews of the Tupolev and the DHL 757, those words meant a collision threat was close. 7 seconds later, the Zurich controller's voice came over the radio, ordering the Tupolev to descend to flight level 350 and to expedite. The Russian pilots, faced with a split-second decision, began to push the nose down, reducing their altitude as instructed. But TCAS was about to issue its final command. In the DHL cockpit, the system called for a descent. The crew responded instantly, dialing in a sharper rate of descent and monitoring their instruments. On the Tupolev, TCAS issued the opposite. Climb, climb. The co-pilot called out the instruction, but the descent continued. The captain, relying on the controller's authority, kept the plane on a downward path. Both aircraft were now descending, their vertical separation shrinking by the second. Radar snapshots from Zurich and Karlsruhe tracked the converging blips as the gap narrowed to less than 1,000 feet. The window for escape was closing. In the space of less than a minute, conflicting voices, machine and human, pulled the crews in opposite directions. The final margin for correction vanished as both planes hurtled toward the same altitude, locked on a collision course above the dark countryside. Seconds before disaster, both cockpits were locked into opposing commands. The DHL 757's TCAS ordered a descent. The crew responded instantly, pitching the nose down and increasing their rate of descent to over 2,400 feet per minute. In the Tupolev, the system called for a climb, but the captain, acting on the controller's voice, kept descending. Flight data recorders captured the Tupolev's autopilot being disengaged, manual controls pushed forward, and a sharp drop in altitude. Both aircraft, now descending, closed the gap at a combined speed of nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. At 23:35 and 29 seconds, the Tupolev's crew finally spotted the DHL jet below and ahead. The pilot pulled back on the yoke, pitching the nose up, an attempt to climb away. But the maneuver came too late. 3 seconds later, at 34,890 feet, the Boeing's vertical stabilizer sliced through the Tupolev's fuselage just ahead of the wings. The collision angle was nearly perpendicular, amplifying the destructive force. The Tu-154 broke apart in midair, its tail and engines separating instantly. The DHL 757, mortally damaged, lost control and began a steep, spiraling descent. In less than a second, 71 lives were lost. The sky above Überlingen fell silent, leaving only wreckage and unanswered questions. The official investigation reached its turning point inside the offices of the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation. Their final report laid bare a chain of organizational failures that stretched far beyond a single night or a single controller. On July 1, 2002, only one air traffic controller, Peter Nielsen, managed 2 busy sectors at Skyguide's Zurich center. He worked alone because a colleague was on a break, a staffing practice that had become routine despite repeated warnings from internal audits and safety reviews. At the same time, scheduled maintenance disabled a key radar system and left some coordination phone lines inoperative. These technical outages forced Nielsen to rely on backup systems, slowing his response and limiting his ability to coordinate with neighboring control centers. Documents revealed that Skyguide management had been warned about the risks of single controller shifts and overlapping maintenance, but failed to act. The BFU concluded that these systemic weaknesses, excessive workload, technical vulnerabilities, and ignored safety alerts, created the conditions for a disaster. Responsibility, they wrote, rested not only with individuals, but with the organization that allowed these hazards to persist. 2 years after the collision, grief and anger collided outside a quiet home in Cloten, Switzerland. Vitaly Kaloyev, a Russian architect who lost his wife and 2 children on the Tupolev, confronted Peter Nielsen, the sky guide controller on duty that night. In February 2004, Kaloyev stabbed Nielsen to death in front of his family. Swiss courts sentenced Kaloyev to 8 years in prison, but he returned to Russia after serving just over 2. There, he was greeted by crowds who saw him not as a criminal, but as a grieving father seeking justice. The killing sparked fierce debate about accountability, forgiveness, and the limits of personal revenge. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of Überlingen reshaped global aviation rules. The International Civil Aviation Organization amended its regulations, making it mandatory for pilots to follow TCAS resolution advisories, even when air traffic control gives conflicting instructions. Airlines overhauled their training, and regulators worldwide adopted the new standard. In Uberlingen and Bashkirtan, annual memorials now honor the victims. Sculptures and plaques stand as reminders, and each year families gather to remember the children, teachers, and crew whose lives were lost. The legacy of that night endures in law, in ritual, and in the determination to prevent such a disaster from happening again. On July 1, 2002, 71 lives were lost in the skies over Überlingen, including dozens of children from a Russian choir. The investigation by Germany's BFU found that a single air traffic controller was left in charge, while technical maintenance left critical safety systems offline. The collision exposed a fatal gap between air traffic control instructions and TCAS collision avoidance alerts, a gap that was unaddressed in international regulations at the time. To this day, some internal SkyGuide communications remain undisclosed, and specific details about decision-making in the final minutes are not fully available to the public. In response, the International Civil Aviation Organization mandated that pilots must always follow TCAS over ATC in a conflict, a rule now standard worldwide. The Überlingen disaster stands as a documented turning point, showing that even in highly regulated environments, system ambiguity can have tragic consequences.